Adam Smith biography. Adam Smith is often identified as the father of modern capitalism. While this description has some truth, it is both overly simplistic and potentially misleading. It's true that few books have shaped modern thought as profoundly as his, An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations. In it, Smith discusses concepts like the division of labor, free trade, self-interest in exchange, price, and the boundaries of government intervention, ideas that mark the transition of economics into the modern age. Yet, The Wealth of Nations is not merely a book about economics. It explores political economy, a field that blends philosophy, political science, history, economics, anthropology, and sociology. In Smith's broader vision, the free market and laissez-faire structures are only two elements within a comprehensive theory of human interaction and social history. Smith was not in fact an economist, but a philosopher. His first book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, examines the natural principles that guide human morality and the ways people come to understand them. Understanding how his two major works connect remains one of the most discussed topics in Smith scholarship, and it's crucial to understanding his views on the market and human activity as a whole. This connection has historically been challenged by what is known as the Adam Smith problem, an idea from the late 19th century that argues Smith's two books are incompatible. According to this view, The Theory of Moral Sentiments assumes altruistic motivation, while The Wealth of Nations allegedly endorses egoism. Most contemporary scholars, however, reject this supposed contradiction and the narrow view of human motivation it implies. Interestingly, Smith never used the term capitalism, a term that didn't gain traction until the late 19th century. Instead, he spoke of commercial society, a term that underscores his belief that economics is only one part of the human condition. While a nation's economic stage may influence its social and political institutions, Smith held that the moral character of a society ultimately defines its humanity. Studying Smith's work today invites us to explore timeless questions about morality and economics. Smith asked why people should act morally, proposed models for how individuals should treat themselves and others, and argued that scientific methods can reveal moral truths. He presented a vision of a just society concerned with the welfare of its most vulnerable members, not only with economic success. In this light, Adam Smith's philosophy is far removed from the libertarian caricature presented by some advocates of laissez-faire markets who view people solely as homo economicus. For Smith, the market was also a mechanism for moral action and social support. Adam Smith's early life and influences. Adam Smith was born in June 1723 in Kirkcaldy, a port town on Scotland's eastern shore, though the exact date remains unknown. His father, a comptroller and collector of customs, passed away before Smith was born, but he left the family with enough resources to ensure their financial stability. Young Adam was educated at the local parish school and in 1737, at the age of 13, went on to Glasgow College before attending Balliol College at Oxford. His experiences in Kirkcaldy and at Glasgow were highly positive, but his time at Oxford left him disillusioned with the professors, an impression that would shape his philosophical outlook. One of Smith's most influential teachers was Francis Hutcheson, a leading figure in the Scottish Enlightenment, and a proponent of moral sense theory. Hutcheson argued that humans make moral judgments based on sentiment rather than pure reason. He believed that a natural sense of unity among people allows for benevolent, other-oriented actions, even though individuals often act from self-interest. According to Hutcheson, moral sense is a form of benevolence that prompts feelings of approval in those who witness moral acts, opposing the view of ethical egoism, which suggests people ultimately act for their own benefit, even when they cooperate with others. The concept of a moral sense was originally introduced by Sir Anthony Ashley Cooper, the 3rd Earl of Shaftesbury, whose work became a focal point for Scottish philosophers like Smith, despite Shaftesbury not being Scottish himself. Shaftesbury viewed personal moral deliberation as a kind of internal dialogue or soliloquy, a model of self-reflection similar to Hamlet's famous introspection. This approach to moral reasoning would later play an important role in Smith's work. The Scottish Enlightenment philosophers, often called the literati, were a close-knit intellectual community who met frequently in social clubs, often at pubs, to discuss politics and philosophy. After Smith graduated from Oxford, he began giving public lectures on moral philosophy in Edinburgh, and with the support of the literati, he secured his first academic position as Chair of Logic at Glasgow University. Smith's closest friendship within this circle, and perhaps the most significant relationship of his life, was with David Hume, an older philosopher whose work Smith was even reprimanded for reading during his time at Oxford. Hume, considered an atheist by many, challenged conventional beliefs in moral philosophy. He expanded on Hutcheson's moral sense theory, proposing that reason is slave to the passions. This means that while intellect can help us understand what is morally right, it is our sentiments that ultimately drive us to act. Hume's famous analogy holds that, much like a horse led to water, one can teach people the meaning of morality, but only their passions, not their rational minds, can inspire them to behave ethically. This idea has roots in Aristotle's distinction between moral and intellectual virtue. Smith did not openly argue for Hume's stance, yet he implicitly accepted much of it. While Smith does not develop a strict moral sense theory, he does adopt Hume's emphasis on sympathy as central to moral behavior. This capacity for sympathy allows humans, as Hume describes, to approve of others' characters, to forget our own interest in our judgments, and to regard those whom we meet with in society and conversation, who are not placed in the same situation, and have not the same interest with ourselves. Treatise, Book 3.3.3. Adam Smith's Life and Legacy. Smith's work on moral philosophy, the theory of moral sentiments, echoes Hume's concept of sympathy, but with some key departures. Smith accepted Hume's view that sympathy drives moral behavior, but rejected his skepticism, introducing a new theory of conscience. In emphasizing Hume's insights, Smith also reflects the Scottish Enlightenment commitment to empiricism, the idea that knowledge comes through the senses rather than innate ideas. While Hume questioned the certainty of cause and effect, Smith applied empiricism to understand how people grasp others' emotions and motivations, and how they use the market to make rational economic decisions. Central to Smith's thinking was the effort to uncover laws governing human behavior. Alongside figures like Adam Ferguson, Smith is sometimes regarded as a founder of sociology, as he and the Scottish literati believed human actions were guided by discoverable principles, much as Newton's principles explained physical motion. Smith deeply admired Newton's systematic approach to science, calling his work the greatest discovery that ever was made by man. For Smith, a successful theory should be both believable and systematic, leading the mind with a narrative that leaves no gaps. This was the model he adopted for both his moral theories and his political economy. As a young philosopher, Smith explored a variety of topics, producing fragments on ancient logic, aesthetics, Rousseau, and metaphysics, among others. Smith's meticulous approach to writing was well known, leading him to order 16 volumes of unpublished work to be burned upon his death, feeling they were unready for public eyes. This loss has left gaps in Smith's intellectual blueprint, inspiring ongoing scholarly attempts to reconstruct his body of work and understand the relationship between his major writings. After a brief period as chair of logic at Glasgow University, Smith was appointed to the chair of moral philosophy, following in the footsteps of his mentor, Hutcheson. During this period, he published The Theory of Moral Sentiments in 1759, likely testing his ideas in the classroom. In 1764, Smith resigned to tutor the Duke of Buccleuch and accompany him on his travels, a common and lucrative career move for educators. This role took Smith to France, where he engaged with the philosophes, a group of French thinkers comparable to his own Scottish literati. How much they influenced Smith's political economy is a matter of debate, but it reflects his alignment with a broader European intellectual community. Upon returning to Kirkcaldy, Smith completed The Wealth of Nations, published in 1776, which received wide acclaim. He would later refer to the book as the very violent attack I had made upon the whole commercial system of Great Britain. While the Theory of Moral Sentiment saw 6 editions in Smith's lifetime, 2 with major revisions, The Wealth of Nations had 4, each with minor updates. Smith himself favored the Theory of Moral Sentiments, as reflected in his ongoing revisions. In 1778, Smith moved to Edinburgh, where he became Commissioner of Customs and published nothing further until his death in 1790. After his passing, The Wealth of Nations grew in influence while the Theory of Moral Sentiments faded into relative obscurity. Yet in recent decades, Smith's work has seen a resurgence in interest. The discovery of early writings, lecture notes, and drafts of The Wealth of Nations has enriched our understanding of his ideas and the ongoing debate around the philosophe's influence on his work. Smith's contributions extended beyond economics. His lectures on rhetoric inspired his student Hugh Blair, who would go on to shape the development of English as an academic discipline. The Theory of Moral Sentiments also influenced 19th-century sentimentalist literature and was cited by Mary Wollstonecraft in A Vindication of the Rights of Women. In the late 20th century, Smith's moral theories experienced a revival, sparking a flood of secondary scholarship and drawing a new audience to his work. This latest wave of interest in Smith highlights 2 trends. First, scholars are now focusing on the relationship between the Theory of Moral Sentiments and The Wealth of Nations, rather than treating Smith's moral and economic theories as separate entities. Second, it is philosophers, not economists, who are leading this research. They seek to situate Smith within the philosophical canon, asking questions such as, how does Smith build on Hume? How does his work relate to Kant, who is known to have read The Theory of Moral Sentiments? How viable is a sentiment-based moral theory? And what can one learn about the Scottish Enlightenment and 18th century philosophy by studying Smith in his historical context? These are just some of the questions that continue to captivate Smith's readers today. In The Theory of Moral Sentiments, Adam Smith weaves together a response to the moral philosophies of his time, drawing heavily on the notion of sympathy, which he adopted from Hume, but expanded into a detailed framework. Smith, Hume, and Hutcheson shared a common intellectual foe in Bernard Mandeville, a philosopher who argued against the social value of benevolence and posited that personal vices produce public benefits. In his provocative work, The Fable of the Bees, Mandeville claims that without vice, society would have no need for law enforcement or commerce driven by indulgence. He regarded virtue as economically disadvantageous and dismissed altruistic human behavior as impractical. Smith, however, was deeply opposed to Mandeville's cynicism, beginning The Theory of Moral Sentiments with a direct rebuttal. However selfish man may be supposed, there are evidently some principles in his nature which interest him in the fortune of others and render their happiness necessary to him, though they derive nothing from it except the pleasure of seeing it. For Smith, sympathy was more than mere pity. It was a fellow feeling that allowed individuals to adopt the perspective of others, and through this imaginative engagement form moral judgments. Rather than relying on abstract moral laws, he claimed that people discern appropriate actions by gauging whether their reactions to others' experiences align with those observed. When an observer can mentally trade places with another and feel similarly, the observer achieves sympathy, which for Smith is a form of moral approval. Smith's concept of sympathy resembles what we now understand as empathy, though broader in scope. Unlike sympathy in today's limited sense of feeling sorry for someone, Smith defined it as the ability to share in any sentiment, joy, anger, or sorrow, by imaginatively assuming another's position. This process is inherently social and requires an observer's familiarity with the background of the person being judged. This interplay between observing emotions and rationally considering their source sets the stage for what Smith views as mutual sympathy, a concept central to moral behavior. Smith explains that sympathy is rarely perfect. Observers typically feel a tempered version of the subject's emotion, moderated through social norms, which then guides moral behavior. People naturally adjust their actions to find common ground with others. This calibration process, where the person observed tempers their expression to match the expected reaction of an impartial observer, allows individuals to learn propriety and develop moral codes. However, Smith was careful to clarify that sympathy is not inspired by raw emotion alone. Rather, the observer gathers context and facts about the other's situation to decide whether the sentiment is fitting. For instance, in empathizing with someone grieving the loss of a loved one, an observer imagines what it is like to be in that specific person's position, not simply projecting their own reaction onto the situation. Smith writes, "When I condole with you for the loss of your only son, in order to enter into your grief, I do not consider what I, a person of such a character and profession, should suffer if I had a son, and if that son was unfortunately to die, but I consider what I should suffer if I was really you, and I not only change circumstance with you, but I change persons and characters." Smith's model of sympathy is not strictly egoistic or altruistic. Rather, it is relational, grounded in an interaction that defies easy categorization as either self-serving or selfless. Smith's view implies that one's happiness and moral growth are rooted in shared perspectives, blending self-interest and concern for others. Further, Smith acknowledges that while sympathy deepens with personal connection, it weakens with emotional or social distance. We naturally modulate our emotions when around strangers or acquaintances, displaying less overt emotion in their presence. This distinction will support Smith's later reflections on duty, which explain how individuals extend moral consideration even to those with whom they share little personal connection. Smith's most nuanced addition to the concept of sympathy is the idea of the impartial spectator. Recognizing that sympathy alone might lead to excessive conformity, he argues that individuals also possess the ability to imagine a neutral observer within their minds. This impartial spectator enables people to step outside social pressures and critically assess their actions, ensuring moral judgments remain balanced and that individuality isn't lost in the pursuit of social harmony. Smith's sympathy-driven framework is thus a complex model, interweaving observation, imagination, and judgment to explain moral behavior. Through the theory of moral sentiments, Smith creates a nuanced portrait of human motivation, one that values both individual autonomy and social connection, revealing a moral philosophy far richer than mere self-interest. Adam Smith's concept of the impartial spectator is a mechanism by which individuals use their imagination to judge their own actions, creating a mental figure who acts as both observer and evaluator. This process, Smith explains, allows one to divide oneself into two roles: the spectator, who judges the action with calm and detachment, and the agent, who is the one being judged. This self-division allows individuals to examine their actions more impartially, and is especially useful in moderating self-deception, which Smith identifies as a significant cause of personal and social discord. This model is influenced by the legacy of Shaftesbury's soliloquy, or the practice of engaging in self-reflection, as if conversing with another. For Smith, this self-reflective dialogue is essential because it counteracts biases that might obscure self-knowledge. In the absence of communal judgment, or when communal judgment is skewed by social norms or institutionalized bias, the impartial spectator acts as a safeguard, allowing individuals to evaluate their actions even when their society fails to see injustices, such as racism or sexism. In acknowledging social biases, Smith recognizes that communities can obscure moral clarity, leading individuals astray. He points to slavery as an example of this societal blindness, condemning the ignorance and brutality of communities that fail to see the humanity of those they oppress. For Smith, the impartial spectator allows individuals to rise above their society's limits, providing a means to recognize injustice even when one's community condones it. However, Smith emphasizes that the impartial spectator is not omniscient. Because this figure is an imaginative construct, it is limited by the individual's perspective and information. As such, Smith acknowledges that no judgment is perfect, as social conditioning inevitably influences it. He points to two moments of self-judgment, before and after an action, when partiality and self-interest may obscure moral clarity, especially at the times when unbiased insight is most needed. Custom and social influence permeate both the community and individual judgment, underscoring that even with the impartial spectator, judgment is fallible. Smith's impartial spectator underscores a belief in gradual moral progress. While individuals cannot achieve perfect judgment, self-reflection and adherence to broad, empirically derived moral principles can guide them. This nuanced view balances the aspirations of moral idealism with the realities of social imperfection, underscoring that personal moral progress often requires transcending the limitations of societal norms. Adam Smith argues that, while human knowledge is inherently limited, people should trust in the unfolding of nature and the natural principles that guide human behavior, be they moral, social, or economic. This trust in natural principles stands in contrast to over-reliance on abstract systems, such as rigid ideologies or dogmatic religions, which Smith warns should not override empirical experience and practical evidence. Systems, he suggests, often overlook individual differences and underestimate the complexity of human motivations. He highlights the impracticality of social engineering, arguing that humans cannot be moved and directed like chess pieces, as each person has their own principle of motion, independent from any design a legislature might try to impose. TMS 218. Smith's wariness of the love of systems underpins his argument for limited government intervention. He emphasizes that harmony of minds, or social stability, depends on freedom of opinion and the exchange of ideas, a principle we might equate with freedom of expression today. TMS 7-427. Smith's famous concept of the invisible hand in the theory of moral sentiments reflects this natural inclination toward balance within society, suggesting that individuals acting in their own interest unintentionally promote societal good. He notes that while wealthy individuals pursue their desires selfishly, consuming only what they need and what brings them pleasure, they indirectly help distribute resources across society. Thus, in seeking personal gain, the rich inadvertently support a fairer allocation of goods, as if guided by an invisible hand that aids the larger community. In The Theory of Moral Sentiments, Smith explains that even though the rich might choose only the most precious and agreeable items for themselves, they consume little more than the poor. Consequently, their vast resources, though concentrated, circulate through society as they employ others, ultimately aiding the economic system. This phenomenon creates a near equitable distribution of necessities, as if the world were divided among everyone equally. TMS 4-110. Smith reasons that this unintentional distribution results from the limits of human consumption. No matter the wealth, a rich person's capacity to consume does not surpass that of the meanest peasant. TMS 4-1-10. Therefore, even in a system where individuals follow their own desires, natural limitations lead to a distribution that sustains the whole society. In sum, Smith's insights blend a pragmatic acceptance of human limitations with an optimistic faith in natural principles. He views the inclination toward systems as a potential danger to individual freedom and practical wisdom, asserting that a natural order, or invisible hand, subtly ensures a social balance that ideological systems may disrupt. This approach argues for allowing nature's plan to take precedence over rigid, human-imposed designs, which may distort the social and economic harmony achieved when individuals are free to pursue their interests within a framework of mutual benefit. Adam Smith's economic theories, particularly his view of the invisible hand, were likely more persuasive in his era, before modern advancements like refrigeration, industrial-scale production, and complex financial systems reshaped economic dynamics. In Smith's time, the practical limits on wealth accumulation and resource consumption meant that the natural distribution of resources could appear more balanced. Smith's arguments were framed within an environment where economic growth, in his view, benefited society broadly, and where the market seemed like a naturally self-regulating force. The concept of unintended consequences, where individuals seeking personal gain inadvertently benefit society, remains significant in the history of economic thought. Still, many economists today would examine this with the nuance added by modern developments in production, finance, and capital consolidation. Smith also cautions against the allure of what he calls the aesthetic attraction of wealth and status. His Newtonian approach emphasizes a rational pursuit of truth, derived from coherence and consistency rather than from ideals or appearances. He warns that a fixation on the beauty of wealth can distort moral values and drive individuals to prioritize wealth over virtue. Society's admiration for the wealthy, he argues, is often misplaced, based more on their visible success than on moral worth. This societal tendency can compromise the impartial spectator, a concept Smith uses to describe an internalized conscience that guides individuals in judging their own actions against an imagined objective perspective. According to Smith, the impartial spectator should be free from societal biases, yet the love of wealth and status can warp this impartiality, leading individuals to make morally flawed judgments. Smith envisions this impartial spectator as a conscience that aligns personal judgment with broader societal standards. He recognizes that these standards vary by factors like upbringing, education, social class, and cultural background more so than by innate differences in ability. In The Wealth of Nations, Smith argues that natural talents among people differ far less than is commonly believed, with most differences resulting from habit, custom, and education. This notion aligns with his belief that society and education should work to bridge these differences, fostering a sympathetic and cooperative community. This ties Smith's moral psychology, how one comes to know virtue, to his identification of virtue itself, what constitutes virtue. Some interpret Smith as a moral relativist, suggesting that since individuals adjust their behavior to societal standards, morality is subjective and bound to cultural norms. However, Smith's Newtonian approach counters this view. By observing human behavior, he argues that we can discover objective moral principles akin to natural laws, implying that morality is grounded in universal truths rather than mere cultural consensus. Influenced by the Stoics, Smith likely saw moral principles as embedded in nature, comparable to Newton's physical laws. Thus, some scholars argue that Smith is a moral realist, proposing that sympathy and the impartial spectator are not mere social constructs but tools for uncovering objective moral truths. This moral realism suggests that certain values and behaviors are right or wrong, regardless of individual beliefs or cultural standards, rooting Smith's philosophy in a vision of ethics governed by universal principles rather than by relative perspectives. In this passage, Smith outlines his view on the general rules of morality, which are derived not from abstract reasoning, but from the cumulative experience of observing and evaluating actions in real situations. Smith argues that moral rules emerge through a kind of inductive process, much like scientific principles. When individuals repeatedly observe instances where a particular action, such as murder, evokes strong condemnation, they eventually recognize that such actions are universally wrong. The moral rule that murder is inherently blameworthy becomes established not simply through isolated feelings but through the pattern of universal disapproval felt by society over time. This process, for Smith, is grounded in natural sentiments, which lead us to instantly condemn heinous acts without needing to refer to pre-existing rules. For instance, when witnessing a betrayal leading to murder, one's immediate reaction is one of repulsion, even without consciously identifying a rule that says, "Murder is wrong." Over time, these repeated judgments across various instances form a general rule of morality. Thus, Smith believes that we come to moral truth through lived experience and the consistent response of our natural sentiments. Smith's view aligns with Aristotelian ethics, in which moral principles are understood as cultivated through both emotional responses and intellectual habits, rather than existing solely as a matter of logical deduction. Unlike Kantian deontology, which establishes moral principles through pure reason, Smith's theory maintains that experience and emotion play a fundamental role in shaping these rules. He suggests that people eventually begin to act on these general rules as principles, guiding behavior not just by emotional response, but by a stable commitment to what they now understand to be morally right. Smith's approach is also Newtonian, mirroring the scientific method of discovering laws through observable patterns. He acknowledges that, like scientific laws, moral rules can be understood and refined by examining concrete instances and finding universal truths within them. Furthermore, Smith anticipates Karl Popper's concept of falsification in the 20th century. Rather than proving a moral truth absolutely, moral principles evolve through rejecting what is false or morally unacceptable, eliminating actions that consistently violate our sense of propriety and justice. For Smith, this cumulative refinement of moral understanding builds a reliable moral framework over time, based on real experiences rather than abstract ideals alone. Smith's emphasis on self-command as a foundational virtue highlights its essential role in moderating the human impulses that can either strengthen or weaken social bonds. For Smith, self-command allows individuals to temper negative emotions like anger, hatred, envy, and revenge, which otherwise disrupt harmony within society. Positive sentiments such as humanity, kindness, and friendship, on the other hand, foster unity and encourage people to live in harmony. Smith's vision of virtue thus has a clear normative focus: cultivate the emotions that bring people together while minimizing those that drive them apart. Additionally, Smith argues that people inherently seek not only to be praised by others, but to be genuinely praiseworthy. This idea ties into his concept of the impartial spectator, the imagined figure of an objective observer, who serves as an internal guide when others are not physically present to provide feedback. The impartial spectator's perspective allows individuals to measure their actions against a standard of genuine worthiness rather than superficial approval. This reflects Smith's conviction that true self-worth comes from adherence to a standard of duty and integrity, not from vanity or empty praise. Smith's reflections on duty also bring him to address the concept of God. Although Smith was a deist, believing in a God who created the world and its principles but does not intervene in human affairs, he still considered the role of divine design in human morality. He proposed that God has set humanity as its own judge, endowing individuals with the capacity to be both self-regulating and conscientious overseers of social conduct. In this view, God's design empowers humans to develop a moral conscience, anchored in the natural desire to act in a way that earns genuine approval from the community and from the impartial spectator within. For Smith, the idea of God's authority primarily serves as a motivational force rather than a direct command. He suggests that when people view the general rules of morality as derived from a divine source, it strengthens their commitment to those rules. This connection, Smith argues, supports social cohesion because individuals become more likely to act with conviction, even in difficult situations, if they believe they are adhering to divinely inspired principles. By appealing to the terrors of religion, Smith indicates that the idea of divine judgment can bolster people's natural sense of duty, encouraging adherence to moral norms. However, Smith was also critical of religious fanaticism, particularly when it leads to divisive factionalism. In The Wealth of Nations, he argues that religious zealotry threatens social and political harmony by fragmenting society into conflicting groups. His approach to religion was thus pragmatic. He saw it as beneficial when it reinforced moral values and social stability, but cautioned against the potential of extreme religious beliefs to disrupt the political and social order. In sum, Smith's views on self-command, duty, and the influence of religious belief reveal his belief in a balanced moral system where self-regulation, societal approval, and a nuanced understanding of divine authority converge to shape virtuous individuals who contribute to social cohesion. For Smith, this balance was essential for a well-functioning society, one that values both personal virtue and collective well-being. For Smith, justice is foundational to a functioning society, an essential virtue that he describes as the main pillar supporting the entire social structure. He regards justice as a negative virtue because while it prevents harm to others, it does not actively promote well-being. Thus, justice sets a minimal standard. It requires individuals to refrain from harming one another, but it does not demand any positive action to benefit others. A person who merely obeys the rules of justice may avoid condemnation, but gains little praise since their actions, as Smith notes, do no real positive good. TMS 2nd, 1-9. Smith's perspective on justice centers on safeguarding individual rights, particularly those concerning personal safety, property, and contractual obligations. He emphasizes that the laws protecting life and personal safety are the most critical, followed by those protecting property and possessions, and lastly, those upholding personal rights derived from promises or contracts. For Smith, violations of these fundamental protections demand a strong response as they disrupt the basic conditions necessary for a stable community. TMS 2nd, T22.3. Smith's discussion of justice in the theory of moral sentiments hints at his more extensive, though incomplete, work on law and government, which he planned but never realized. His lectures on jurisprudence suggest that his vision for justice would have been broader, encompassing various principles of law and governance. Unfortunately, the manuscript of this proposed work was among the writings Smith instructed to be burned upon his death, creating gaps that have left scholars speculating about its potential contributions. These gaps highlight that the theory of moral sentiments represents only part of Smith's comprehensive system of thought, which includes his work on political economy and the wealth of nations. The relationship between these two works is not one of contradiction but of complementarity. While they emphasize different aspects, moral psychology and virtue in one, economic and social structures in the other, their central principles interconnect. Justice, which underpins Smith's moral philosophy, is equally vital in his political economy, where individual rights, fair transactions, and respect for property are fundamental to a thriving market and society. In this integrated system, each work supports the other, presenting a holistic view of human behavior and social structure where moral considerations inform economic practices and vice versa. Far from being a radical departure, Smith's political economy extends the principles he explored in his moral philosophy, providing a unified perspective on human welfare, society's role, and the balance between individual rights and collective good. In The Wealth of Nations, Smith redefines the concept of wealth, placing it on a foundation of labor rather than the accumulation of stock or money within a nation. This shift challenges the prevailing mercantilist views of his time, which held that wealth was static and tied to the volume of goods and resources within national borders. Smith argues instead that labor generates wealth, and the potential for growth is practically limitless when harnessed through productivity and specialization. The book's 5 sections create a coherent system of political economy that integrates historical analysis, economic theory, and philosophical inquiry. Its emphasis on labor's productivity culminates in Smith's famous example of the pin factory, where division of labor drastically increases output and efficiency. This example illustrates Smith's belief that specialization within a free market doesn't only boost productivity, but also encourages innovation and self-interest to benefit society as a whole. According to Smith, the free market taps into a natural propensity for trade and exchange, linking individual gain to communal benefit. The notion that self-interest fuels communal good is crystallized in Smith's oft-cited observation that it is not the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that provides us with our meals, but their own self-interest. WN 2. Here, Smith reconfigures moral assumptions around self-interest. Whereas Christian morality traditionally denounced self-interest as sinful, Smith reframes it as a legitimate and constructive force when directed toward economic activity. By allowing individuals to focus on their needs and wants, a market naturally encourages contributions that sustain others, an approach modern advocates of free trade and globalization often champion. Smith's approach emphasizes not just self-interest, but also interdependence. He explores this concept through the example of a woolen coat and the vast network of labor required to produce even such a basic commodity. By identifying the many individuals involved, from shepherds and dyers to shipbuilders, Smith underscores that even the simplest purchase engages countless workers, ultimately distributing wealth throughout society. Smith's insight into the unintended benefits of self-interested actions leads him to introduce the metaphor of the invisible hand, which appears throughout The Wealth of Nations to describe how individuals pursuing their own economic interests inadvertently promote societal welfare. Smith's invisible hand principle critiques mercantilist policies by asserting that efforts to manipulate the market often result in less benefit than if it were allowed to function freely. For Smith, nature operates logically with predictable principles that should not be artificially tampered with. In the theory of moral sentiments, Smith expressed similar skepticism toward social engineering, and here, he contends that efforts to direct economic outcomes can often do more harm than good. By pursuing self-interest, individuals contribute to societal prosperity, often more effectively than they would by attempting to act explicitly for the public good. Moreover, Smith's views on wealth distribution challenge traditional ideas of economic disparity. He acknowledges inevitable class distinctions, but argues that commercial society provides comforts and benefits to the lower ranks that were unattainable in feudal systems. Smith contends that the poorest members of a commercial society, while modestly accommodated, are better off than many of the wealthiest in less developed societies. This view echoes his argument in The Theory of Moral Sentiments that wealth is distributed through market interactions as if by an invisible hand, ensuring a baseline of communal welfare. Smith also dismisses the idea of a social contract, proposing instead that human societies are natural extensions of social evolution, not created artificially through agreements. For Smith, societal structure is a product of gradual development, governed by principles of natural logic and inherent social organization. The same natural principles that govern moral actions in The Theory of Moral Sentiments also guide economic and political behaviors in The Wealth of Nations, forming an interconnected philosophy where morality, economics, and society function as parts of a unified natural system. Smith's work, therefore, lays the groundwork for understanding the free market not as a space for unbridled consumerism, but as a structure that aligns individual interest with social benefit, facilitating economic justice through principles inherent to human nature. Smith's four-stage theory of civilization, hunting, shepherding, agriculture, and commercial society, exemplifies his belief in a natural, logical progression in human history. For Smith, each stage represents a societal improvement over the last, with commercial society as the pinnacle of social and economic advancement. This model, which emphasizes historical determinism, influenced later thinkers such as Karl Marx. The sequence of stages shapes Smith's view of history as a predictable progression in which economic and social conditions drive the development of political structures. He argues, for instance, that only a commercial society can support a republican government, highlighting his belief that economics fundamentally influences politics. Smith's discussions of price and value further illustrate his quest for objective standards within the fluctuations of market economics. He distinguishes between natural price, which covers production costs, and market price, in which reflects current market conditions. Ideally, a well-functioning market gravitates towards an alignment of natural and market prices, reflecting true value. Smith's idea of perfect liberty, where workers have the freedom to change trades at will, also supports this alignment, asserting that a free market aligns with natural principles and optimizes economic interactions. The value paradox, why diamonds are more expensive than the more essential resource, water, leads Smith to his distinction between value in use, utility, and value in exchange, market value. While scarcity partly explains this, Smith also looks to labor as a consistent metric for value, proposing a labor theory of value. By this account, the value of an item can be measured by the labor required to obtain it. This measure, which he believed could offer a stable, objective reference point, places Smith's concept of value on a universal human capacity, labor. Smith's insistence that labor is a universal measure reflects his commitment to finding objective standards in a complex economic system. Much like the impartial spectator in his moral philosophy, labor serves as a constant measure across societal and historical contexts, countering the shifting values of currency or commodities. Although Smith's labor theory of value is debated, he considered it an impartial way to gauge worth in a fluctuating system. Smith's economic vision extends to his broader philosophy, where society functions best under conditions of free exchange and limited government intervention. His invisible hand metaphor encapsulates this idea, suggesting that self-interested behavior in a free market naturally leads to communal benefits, an outcome disrupted when government oversteps. A well-functioning commercial society, Smith argues, harmonizes individual motives and communal welfare by adhering to natural principles that govern both economic and social systems. Through this integration of natural and social order, Smith's economic theories in The Wealth of Nations reflect his broader Enlightenment commitment to understanding humanity through empirical, consistent standards. The Wealth of Nations is indeed much more than a foundational text on economic exchange. It's a comprehensive work of political economy that examines the ideal government form for promoting commercial prosperity and self-interest. Here, Smith develops his natural liberty concept, advocating a system where markets self-regulate, minimizing the need for heavy state intervention. His three outlined roles for the sovereign, protection from invasion, justice enforcement, and maintaining public goods, showcase his restrained but nuanced vision of government responsibilities. Smith's third role for the sovereign, upholding public goods, illustrates a more active governmental role than laissez-faire characterizations often suggest. He argues that public works, such as roads and educational institutions, are necessary where private interest wouldn't cover costs adequately for society's benefit. In Book 5, Smith's arguments on education are particularly significant, as he links it to social cohesion and the development of individuals capable of critical thinking, underscoring his belief in education as a deterrent against religious extremism and an antidote to the intellectual stagnation caused by repetitive labor tasks. Smith warns that without mental engagement, the worker becomes incapable of participating fully in society or appreciating the public good. To counteract this, he calls for state-sponsored education that promotes intellectual, social, and even martial virtues. For Smith, such education not only uplifts individuals, but also makes them more moral and informed citizens. He argues that only by cultivating imagination and intellect can one practice true sympathy, a cornerstone of his moral theory. Throughout The Wealth of Nations, Smith's views on government reflect his commitment to both economic efficiency and the moral welfare of citizens. His advocacy for limited government intervention is moral as well as economic, aligned with his pursuit of universal opulence that enhances the lives of all citizens, particularly the poorest. His integration of morality and economics provides a foundation for understanding his influence and defends against the so-called Adam Smith problem, which posits a split between his moral philosophy and economic theories. Smith's work has shaped discussions around societal organization and the principles of human behavior, inquiry, and ethics. His philosophy continues to stimulate debate, as seen in the resurgence of Smith studies in the late 20th century, emphasizing his enduring relevance to modern questions of government's role in economic and moral life.